When you're standing at a client's office, pulling up a 3D model on a laptop that can't keep up, the temptation is to reach for the biggest desktop you can find. But the reality for most of us is a need for something that travels, that plugs into the tools we already own, and that actually delivers the performance we promise ourselves we'll need on the road. That tension between portability and power, between paying for specs you'll never use and ending up with a machine that can't handle the workload, makes the decision to buy a mobile workstation feel a lot riskier than picking a regular notebook. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this review, I'm going to walk through the HP Zbook 14U G6 the way a real-world buyer would, looking past the headline numbers, testing the day-to-day workflow, and figuring out whether the price tag actually reflects the value you'll get. First off, the Zbook 14U G6 is marketed as a mobile workstation, which in HP's terminology means it's been validated for professional software like AutoCAD, SolidWorks, and Adobe Premiere. The hardware reflects that promise: a 14-inch 38402160 IPS panel, a 10th Gen Intel Core i7-8665U, 32GB of DDR4 RAM, a 1TB NVMe SSD, and an AMD Radeon Pro WX 3200 with 4GB of VRAM. On paper, that sounds like a solid mix for a creator or engineer who needs a crisp, color-accurate screen and enough memory to keep large assemblies or video timelines in RAM. The real question is how those pieces work together when you're actually editing a 4K render on a train, running a parametric simulation in a coffee shop, or just joining a Teams call with a couple of spreadsheets open. Let's start with the display. The 4K IPS screen is genuinely useful if your work revolves around visual fidelity. I tried opening a 300-page architectural PDF with embedded high-resolution renders, and the text stayed razor-sharp while the images retained detail without any noticeable scaling artifacts. The wide gamut color mode, which you can enable in the HP Dreamcolor software, gave me confidence that the reds in a branding mock-up weren't oversaturated, something you'll notice when you hand a client a proof that looks like it was printed on a calibrated monitor. For anyone who spends a lot of time in Photoshop or Lightroom, that screen alone justifies a higher price than a standard 1080p notebook. The CPU, an i7-8665U, sits in the U low power class, which means it's built for efficiency rather than raw horsepower. In practice, that translates to a laptop that can sustain about 15-20 minutes of continuous heavy load before the fans kick in at a noticeable level. I ran a 10-minute simulation of a fluid dynamics model in ANSYS, and the CPU handled the calculations without throttling, but the clock speed hovered around 2.8 GHz instead of the advertised 4.8 GHz boost. For most CAD work, that's fine. The software leans heavily on single-thread performance, and the i7U delivers enough to keep the viewport responsive. However, if your workflow relies on multi-core rendering, say you're doing CPU-based 3D rendering with V-Ray, the 4-core 8-thread layout will feel modest compared to a desktop-class i9 or a Xeon with 12+ cores. So the Zbook is a good fit for engineers and designers whose main bottleneck is GPU acceleration or memory, but not the ideal choice for heavy-duty video encoding that lives entirely on the CPU. Speaking of GPU, the Radeon Pro WX 3200 is a professional card that's certified for many ISV, independent software vendor, applications. In Premiere Pro, I was able to offload color grading and basic effects to the GPU without crashes, and the playback of a 4K sequence stayed smooth at 30 frames per second. The 4GB of VRAM is enough for most 2D work and moderate 3D scenes, but if you regularly push 8K footage or large texture maps, you'll start hitting the memory ceiling and see frame drops. The card isn't a gaming GPU, so you won't get the same performance in titles like Cyberpunk, but that's not the intended use case. The 32GB of RAM and the 1TB SSD are where the Zbook really shines in day-to-day productivity. With that amount of memory, I could keep a full Revit model, a Photoshop document with several smart objects, and a set of background Chrome tabs open without resorting to virtual memory. The SSD's NVMe interface gave me sub-second boot times and near-instant file transfers. Moving a 5GB video clip from the desktop to the editing timeline took less than 3 seconds. That speed matters when you're on a deadline and can't wait for a sluggish hard drive to catch up. Battery life is where the trade-off becomes obvious. The 14-inch chassis houses a 71 Wh battery, which sounds generous, but the 4K screen and professional GPU draw more power than a standard 1080p business laptop. In my testing, I got about 4.5 hours of mixed-use email, spreadsheets, a bit of video playback.